than air travel, really, because nothing travelled faster than a horse before. It would take 4 days to get from London to York, and then suddenly you could get there in a few hours, and that actually changed the whole
unless
nature.
ASLEF go on strike,
society.
of course.
And so we'll come to that issue later. But that's why my fascination is about the social effects of railways, and that's why people are more interested in my books. The rail enthusiasts do buy my books, and they form a core of people who buy them. But I do try and write books that are accessible to
well, you see,
people who just have an interest.
This latest one, I think, is a very skillful one, because you've got the railway audience there, but you've also got the World War II audience. And we know that, of all non-fiction books, you write a book about some aspect of the Second World War, instant bestseller. Often the case.
I'm hoping for that. Let me just tell briefly the story of that, which is, it's called The Liberation Line. And I've called it the last untold story of the Normandy landings. And it really is, right? So when we were preparing for D-Day, we blew up the French and Belgium and Dutch railways. We sent over vast amounts of bombers to blow them up. The Resistance kind of chimed in and blew up a lot of the railways. And yet when we invaded, June the 6th, 1944, we then needed the railways. And there was a recognition of that. We took over with us eventually 2,000 locomotives, 20,000 freight wagons, and some 50,000 men to rebuild the railways. Now, the odd thing about this, Iain, is that there's been countless books about D-Day and the Second World War. There have been countless books about the railways. But nobody has told the story of these wonderful men who just went over there to rebuild railways, often right behind the lines, getting shot at, getting strafed by aircraft and risking their lives, and some of them got killed. And without the railways, we could not have proceeded forward. We just said how important the railways for the development of capitalism. The railways are also very important for the way that war was waged. And it's just a mystery to me as to how I stumbled upon this story and that nobody had told it before. So,
that's what you want as an author, isn't it?
Yes, no, it's gold dust, and I've been very fortunate, and I came across a researcher called Nancy Cunningham, who'd in America, who'd actually spent 25 years building up a kind of blog post about these people who kind of rebuilt the railways, and she'd been waiting for me. She said when I first emailed her that nobody had ever kind of listened to her. And then suddenly I had all this research, really prime research, kind of typewritten reports, contemporary reports by the battalions who were kind of building bridges over the Seine, bridges over the Rhine, rebuilding lines everywhere that had been absolutely destroyed. So this is both an adventure story, but a very important strategic story about the Second World War, and I think it might give a lot of people a new understanding of that war.
Did you have to gain knowledge of military strategy and how supply lines work in war? Because I imagine that was not something that you might have been an expert on before.
I did, and wonderfully, a guy from the Royal Engineers, the historian who's called Mungo Melvin, General Mungo Melvin, who wrote the foreword to it, he was extremely helpful in showing me how things happened. I talked to several other military experts. And read a hell of a lot. The Americans were very good at producing vast reports on what they did during the war and what went right and what went wrong. We're less good at that. The Royal Engineers have got some good reports on that, but actually the Americans documented absolutely everything very thoroughly with very academic reports. And so I ploughed through all this. It took me longer than most of my books. It was a couple of years, actually, that it took me to put this book together. And there's 100 stories that I haven't told in it that I could tell because of all this material I've got. And, there's all sorts of possible spin-offs. I think this is Hollywood's story, really, because at the core of the story, there's a railway that was rebuilt in 3 days. A 135-mile long railway in France was rebuilt in 3 days by 10,000 men who needed the railway to allow Patton to continue through to Paris. And oddly enough, Iain, 135 miles long is precisely the length for HS2.
So they didn't have to get planning permission.
They didn't have to get planning permission, absolutely.
But when you look at what's going on in Ukraine, I can't remember who it was. I think it was a British MP. This is in the early days of the war in Ukraine. And he had marvelled at the ability of the Ukrainians to not only rebuild bombed railway lines, but also to repair the trains as well and get them back working, because they knew that their supply lines were had to be guaranteed by railway movement. And if the railway lines didn't work, they couldn't supply the troops on the front line.
Absolutely. And I've studied this to some extent because I'm hoping it might be my next book. Because the story of the Ukraine railways and how they rebuilt them, and also how they destroyed the Russian railways behind them. One of the reasons, if you remember, right at the beginning of the war, the Russians got stuck north of Kiev because they expected to kind of just waltz into Kiev. And one of the reasons they got stuck was because the railway lines behind them had been destroyed by, in particular, bridges by the Ukrainian forces. And so they got stuck because you need a railway line all the time behind you to carry the tanks, to carry the material and so on. And oddly enough, the Ukraine war bears some semblance to the First World War, when, if you remember, the two sides were stuck for 3.5 years, and they were stuck because they were fed by railways behind them on both sides. And the same sort of thing has happened in the Ukraine war. They're kind of recreating the First World War because of the transport difficulties. So there's a lot of resonance and a lot of stuff in my book. The current book, The Liberation Line, is actually quite resonant of the Ukraine war, kind of 80 years on.
And a lot of the books, a lot of the films that have been made about D-Day, they concentrate on effectively taking the beaches. But that would not be possible without the supply lines, and without sort of, as soon as the land was taken, they had to build beachheads, and obviously there wasn't a railway across the channel or anything. But as soon as they started taking different towns in northern France, presumably that's when the work started.
Absolutely. And if you look at the back of that book, unfortunately listeners can't see that, but if you see the picture on the back shows that they built railway lines right on the beaches and took material off the landing craft right onto those rails. And they devised a special sort of a flap that would go up and down with the tides to enable them to do that. And that cut out a lot of hassle at the ports, where you had to kind of lift stuff over ships and stuff. And there they just brought in the wagons and the locomotives directly onto the beaches. And that was something that surprised Hitler. He couldn't understand how they supplied themselves so quickly. And one of the reasons they supplied themselves so quickly was because of this device to bring stuff right onto the beaches straight away. And it was that photograph that inspired me to write this book, actually, because my agent said, what is going on in this picture, which was in a previous book of mine called Engines of War. And he said, I'm really fascinated about what is going on here. And so I started researching it, and the result is the book.
There was obviously a huge amount of planning that went into D-Day, which we should say is the 80th anniversary this year. And have you been to the Normandy beaches?
I have been to the Normandy beaches. I've been to the Normandy beaches on D-Day a couple of years ago, and I'm going on this D-Day. I'm going to actually on a sponsored cycle ride for the Armed Forces charity, and I'm going to be cycling round the beaches, 80 miles actually.
It is an amazing experience to imagine what was going on. Just I went in 1994. I took my dad, and we went the week before D-Day when they were doing all of the preparations, because Bill Clinton was going to do a big speech. And it was, I talked about it actually on a podcast a few days ago. It was one of the best experiences of my life, just sort of trying to imagine what was going on there, and people my age, I suppose, at the time, forming most of the soldiers that went across. And but when you start thinking of what happened in the days and weeks after D-Day, that must have all been planned for. I mean, you can't just sort of decide, oh, well, we'll build a railway here on a whim and then just do it. There must have been people planning for this for months, if not years.
Absolutely, and I described that. The first 2 chapters are devoted to the fact that this was highly planned, and also they had to bring over vast amounts of equipment, sleepers and rails, and then, as I said, 2,000 locomotives and all this equipment. And they realised right from the start that the railways were the main way that war material would be carried further forward. And yet the stories always are about trucks and trucking and how everything goes by lorries. But actually, it was the railways that made all the difference. And at one point, as I describe in the book, in September, October 1944, they get forward to Paris and they take most of eastern France very quickly, and then they get stuck. And why do they get stuck? Because they don't have enough rail capacity behind them to feed and give ammunition to the troops to invade Germany. And so they're actually stuck. And General Patton is particularly furious at this because Patton always likes to be moving and kind of going forward. But they run out of their supply lines. And it is only when the supply line is then kind of able to get material through again that they can then advance. And of course, then they have the Battle of the Bulge, and the Germans counterattack, and that delays things further. But in some of the studies I've written, that if it hadn't been for the railways and the energy and effort that was put into the railways, the war might well have gone on until 1946 or even beyond. So it made all the difference.
Mo wants to take issue with something that you said. He says the first public railway was the Stockton and Darlington in 1825.
I will dispute that. The Stockton and Darlington was a ramshackled affair that was mainly horse drawn. It was a single track line between 2 places that have not even had a football league club, let alone 2 Premiership teams. The Liverpool Manchester 5 years later was a double track railway, entirely hauled by locomotives, apart from a static locomotive at the Liverpool end. It ran in people in both directions. It was of people as well as freight. And although the Stockton Darlington is being celebrated in next year as the first railway, it's not, I think it's more the last of the wagonways, which were the coal kind of railways that fed largely coal to water, to navigable rivers, rather than the Liverpool and Manchester, which is a proper railway between 2 Premiership cities.
I think
I will take issue.
I think you win that one. Sean says, why didn't the D-Day landings happen the previous day? It's because of the weather, wasn't it?
The weather stopped them doing that. But they couldn't have delayed very much longer because everything was expected to happen then.
Iain, unabashed promotion of a mate's book. Give us a break. I mean, seriously? You think we shouldn't be taught what he said? Christian and I had a bit of a falling out. But, I mean, seriously, it's not about promoting interviewing Liz Truss for 80 minutes the other day. I was accused of promoting Liz Truss's book. Yeah. Well, if someone writes a book on an interesting subject, I think people want to hear about it.
Absolutely.
It's the 80th anniversary.
This is not cronyism. If you thought the book was uninteresting, you wouldn't cover it. So.
Admittedly, Christian did email saying, I've got a book out. Could I come on your programme to talk about it? And I said, absolutely, because it's an interesting subject.
Absolutely.
No conspiracy theory, no corruption. I had to explain that I didn't actually benefit from a penny of Liz Truss's book. People seem to think that I would make a profit out of it somehow. And
also, we vaguely support different political parties.
And different political football teams. Different
football teams, absolutely, yes. Indeed. Yes.
Anyway,
both London football teams.
Let's move on. We'll come to some of your calls in a minute. Loads and loads of texts coming in, actually.
Yeah.
So we could we could fill the rest of the programme with just text questions, but we'd love to hear from you on the phones as well. 0345 6060 973. It's 19 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Iain Dale on LBC.
21 minutes past 8. Christian Wolmar is here, the author of The Liberation Line, the last untold story of the Normandy landings. Now, you join us on a interesting news day, particularly from Labour, where they're saying they are going to, well, they say renationalise the railways, but is it really renationalisation as we know it?
No, and it's sort of partial. It's not the recreation of British Rail. I think it's important to say
good.
that. Well, we might argue over that. I wrote a book about British Rail, and I was largely in favour of it. But anyway, the point is that it's a partial renationalisation. So they'll take over the operations of the railway, basically, the train services. And they've already the government has already taken over 4 out of the dozen or so franchises because they got into financial trouble or whatever. So it's not huge. But I think what is interesting, Ian, is this has had enormous publicity and largely favourable publicity. And it is, in a way, the first major reversal of a privatisation that was undertaken by the Tories in the 1980s and 1990s. And I think they've sort of caught the public mood on this. Now, even though the public might not understand quite the details of it and the fact that actually the railways are already largely in private and public hands because Network Rail, which was Railtrack, went bust and was taken back into government hands. But I think it's kind of captured a sort of bit of imagination. People like the idea of the state taking back the railways, even if they didn't necessarily love BR in the first place.
But I think, aren't the general public, and I agree with you, I think public sentiment is in that direction, but aren't the general public going to be inevitably disappointed, given that Louise Haigh, the Shadow Transport Secretary, has said today, well, don't expect fares to go down because they won't?
No, but there might be a kind of more rational fares system. They might actually manage to attract more people onto the railways by providing a kind of better service and therefore able to keep fares from rising so fast. Remember, it is in the hands of the government how you determine the fares rises each year. That is something that is decided by the government. So they don't have to put the fares up by so much, as has happened in the last few years.
But people say that the railways haven't had enough investment. Well, where's that investment going to come from? Because if the government then effectively owns the railways, there are only 2 ways of funding railways, through more subsidies or through higher fares.
Yeah.
And I don't imagine that Rachel Reeves is going to suddenly say to Louise Haigh, oh, it's fantastic that we're renationalising railways. Here's another £10 billion over the next couple of years.
No, but you can boost the numbers using the railways, which would
But that's happened under privatisation.
It's gone down at COVID, and then
but up until then,
yeah.
if you looked, I mean, I haven't got the numbers in front of me, but if I remember correctly,
they doubled.
They doubled, exactly.
Yes, they doubled, but that
right.
wasn't the result of privatisation. It was a result of what Gordon Brown called exogenous factors.
Really?
Yes, because the proof of that is that the London Underground,
Your Honour.
The London Underground went up by the same percentage rise, and that was publicly owned.
But there was a huge amount of private sector investment into rolling stock, wasn't there, in the 1990s? I mean, I remember the line that I used coming into Charing Cross used to have terrible sort of slam door coaches, and then suddenly, almost within a year, every single train had been replaced by a new one, and they were fantastic.
Yes, but now we've had a hiatus in rolling stock investment. I mean, it was always a bit lumpy, and we've got the problem now of the rolling stock companies actually closing down. Yes, the rolling stock is one example where the private sector did invest money, but you can't suggest that the train operators invested money in, because they were merely told to operate certain services and either received a subsidy or paid a premium for that, but they didn't actually invest any money. So that won't make much difference if they're in state hands or in private hands.
Let's go to Mohammed in Manchester, who's I think he's asking a question related to this. Hi, Mohammed.
How are you doing, sir? You okay?
Good, thank you. What would you like to ask Christian?
Yeah, you just mentioned something what I overheard as well about reasonably being the fare being fair. I don't think it's reasonably fair on how much you're charging compared to what people's earnings are nowadays, and it is really a shame, really, because the investment that they have put into this railway, the government, billions and billions of pounds, is nothing compared to what people spend, in other countries, and we're far behind. When it comes to our railway and our interaction with railway and how people love the railway in this country is nothing compared to other countries. We're 25 years behind, places like Japan and all these countries. And our money's not been well spent by the government, and it never is. I mean, like, if you go to, even in Manchester now, I grew up in Manchester. I mean, the traffic in Manchester is horrendous, and London is obviously bad as it is. Birmingham's getting really, really worse. I mean, the best thing they should have realised, like, look, these kind of problems that we're having, railway can save a lot of our, pollution. It's very, very good to invest in these, but how can we make the best out of it? They've not made the best out of it.
I agree with you that the fares are too high. And that's a political decision that has been made over the years, actually, by government. In other countries, governments do put a higher proportion of the cost of the railways indirectly as taxpayers than we do. And that's something that has long kind of rankled. I think the railways provide, as we were talking about when we were talking about the history of the railways, the railways provide a very important service. And the idea that they have to pay their way, that they can't be subsidised, and any subsidy is a waste of money, I think is really a mistaken thinking. They actually enable people to get around, enable people to get to jobs. They're good for environmental reasons. They're very important as part of decarbonisation and so on. They reduce congestion on the roads, and that should be recognised through subsidies that the government pays, and other countries recognise that more than us.
How much do taxpayers put into the railways each year?
It's about 5 billion.
Quite a lot of money, isn't it?
And it's been more up since COVID, actually.
But in France and Germany, what would that figure be?
I don't know precisely, but they pay a higher proportion of the cost of the railways. That's all I can say. I mean, that is well recognised. That's why fares are lower, because they pay more of it comes from taxpayers.
I mean, in a way, if you're travelling outside peak periods, i.e. later in the day, I mean, the fares aren't that extortionate, are they, generally?
You can get good deals. You can get advanced fares, and off-peak and super off-peak fares are okay, particularly when you're old. You get 30% off.
Well, you see that. I've got a senior rail card, and I think it's fantastic.
Yes,
but then I start thinking to myself, well, should a 60-year-old really get a senior rail card? Should they not ally it with the pension age?
Well, I think a really good move that Labour could do, and I don't think would cost that much, would be to enable everybody to have a 30% off card. So anybody who buys the card for, say, 30 or 50 quid for a year then gets discounts on every journey. And I think that would really encourage rail use, and I suspect it might well pay for itself. So I think that's what the Labour Party has to do. It has to work out incentives to get people to travel, and particularly off-peak.
Yeah, because I think the prices for commuter travel, I mean, I'm lucky I don't have to come in during the morning. And when I did, I really would blanch at what I was paying. But now with my senior rail card, I come in from Tunbridge on a single journey, if I'm staying in London, £9, 5p.
Right.
I think that's
not a bad deal.
I think that's fine. I don't think that's too high for anybody. And you can, if you book in advance, you can get it for like £6. So, but it's very complicated, isn't it?
Yes.
You have to trust the technology that it's giving you the right fare, and I'm not sure that it always does.
No, and that's something that Labour mentioned today, that they're going to try and guarantee that. Now, I think that's actually technically quite difficult, because a lot of people buy their tickets via Trainline and via other methods, and trying to assess exactly what the lowest fare is and trying to make Trainline do that is going to be quite complicated. And, I doubt whether they'll be able to enforce that.
Well, we have lots of calls coming in, lots of texts. We'll get through as many as we can before 9 o'clock. It is 8:31, news time on LBC with Daryl Jackson.
The Scottish Green Party will join with rival MSPs to back a no-confidence motion in Humza Yousaf next week. Earlier, the First Minister ended a power-sharing agreement with the Greens after ditching a key climate target last week. A 13-year-old girl has been charged with 3 counts of attempted murder after 2 teachers and a teenage pupil were stabbed at Ammon Valley School in Carmarthenshire. All the victims have now left hospital. And the Transport Secretary's told LBC Labour's promise to renationalise the railways would do nothing to help passengers. The party's promising to make the change within 5 years if it wins a general election. LBC weather showers easing this evening, some cloud but chilly where the sky is clear and a low of -2.
This is LBC. Iain Dale. Call 0345 6060 973. Text 84850. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
I should have mentioned this before, but we are streaming this hour live on Global Play. If you'd like to watch us as well as listen to us, we have Christian Wolmar with us, transport commentator and rail expert, and he's the author of the upcoming book. Is it upcoming? Isn't it already out?
Yeah, on May the 2nd.
May the 2nd, right. The Liberation Line. It's about railway workers' roles in assisting the Allied victory over the Nazis following D-Day. But we're also taking calls on rail renationalisation. That's what Labour have announced today. We're going to do a lot more on that next week. But any other transport issue that you'd like to pick Christian's brain on, feel free to phone in. Andrew is in Cumbernauld in central Scotland. Andrew, hi.
Hello there. Good evening, both of you.
Hi.
It was just to pick Christian's brains. My understanding of the proposed renationalisation is just basically to let the top companies' contracts expire and they become sort of renationalised by default at the end of it. I was wondering what his perspective on the rolling stock companies would be. I'm not seeing any part of that, and it was my understanding that one of the biggest cash cows in the rail industry or the rail privatisation was the rolling stock companies. Is there a view on how they will be dealt with? Are they to be renationalised? Are they to have their contracts just let the weather and then Great Britain Railways would just replace their own stock and then just allow the Roscoes to wither on the vine?
It's a very interesting question. Basically, when Labour were last in power, there was an investigation into the rolling stock companies, and they were thinking of trying to kind of circumvent them, and decided that in the end it was too complicated to do so. And now in this new version of what might be the Labour government, they've also looked at the rolling stock companies, but they made pretty clear in the document they put out today that they're going to leave them alone, and that indeed, if they do buy new trains, they'll probably use the rolling stock companies, because otherwise the money comes off the government balance sheet, and that then competes with building hospitals and schools and the army and whatever else. And they don't want to do that. Now, yes, they do make quite a lot of money. They make a very healthy rate of return on the money they put into the industry. But they have actually invested, which a lot of the companies involved in the privatisation haven't really invested. As I mentioned earlier, the train operating companies don't really invest. So I think Labour is playing it safe on this one and keeping the rolling stock companies there.
Wasn't the basic problem with a lot of the basic problem lie with the franchising system? Is that nobody is going to buy a train with a lifespan of 30 years on a 7-year
absolutely
franchise, and if that whole structure is to be eradicated, would it not actually make more sense for new, even if the existing leases with the existing stock under the existing Roscoes is to be left?
You're very well informed, sir. Yes, I mean you're absolutely.
It make sense for new trains to be acquired by GBR?
Yeah.
Wouldn't it actually make more long-term sense, and would actually be cheaper for everybody, government, GBR, passengers, and everybody, for the new trains just to be acquired straight into the GBR?
I totally agree with you. I think cutting out the Roscoes as middle men would be definitely cheaper. The only problem is there is this ridiculous notion that if you lease it for a rolling stock company, it doesn't then appear on the government balance sheet as debt. But if you buy it directly in the way that you suggest, yes, it's cheaper, because government can always get money cheaper than private companies because of the low risk, but it then appears on the balance sheet. Now, take that to your MPs and argue the case, because you're dead right. It would be cheaper to do it directly, but it's one of these ridiculous kind of treasury rules that we have that makes no sense in economic terms, but kind of somehow makes sense for the treasury. So thank you.
Andrew, thank you for that. This is from Graham. He says, I've just read your book, Christian, Blood, Iron and Gold, and thoroughly enjoyed it. Question, would this country have been better off if the government of the day had forgone building motorways and invested in the railways instead?
That's a very interesting question. Well, France has done both, and Spain has done both, and Italy has done both. I somewhat suspect that however many railways you built, you would still need some form of better roads. And I have a vision of Britain that is completely different. In one of my books, I've described it, that I loved Britain around 1910, right? And that's what I called the Agatha Christie Britain, when actually railways went actually everywhere, to every little village. And the last mile or so was in a horse and cart, and you could get around the whole of the country like that. Unfortunately, once you invented the motor car, I don't think you could keep it in the garage. And so I love your vision, but I'm afraid that even if they had invested a lot more money in railways, I suspect they would have also still ended up with dual carriageways and motorways.
One of my earliest memories was watching the railway track being dug up at the bottom of one of my father's fields. And I remember there was a big crane that toppled over, and this was very exciting for a four-year-old. And I just wonder whether you think that if the beaching lines had not been axed, what difference that would have made Well, it made a huge difference.
This
to
was
the
a
railway
line
system.
that was being torn up because
this was a single track line between two villages, which happened to go past I won't say the end of our garden because there was a field, but. And I can remember actually going on that track, even at the age of 3 or 4, and there was a sort of little halt that would stop sort of at the bottom, and then people they'd go off to the Market Day in Saffron Walden on the train, and then they could go off to Linton and then get into Cambridge, which of course, once the railway line was taken up, they could only go by car.
Yes, I'm afraid that I don't think that line could ever have really been viable. And I think even by viable, I don't mean that it had to pay its way, but that it would have required so much subsidy that it just wasn't worthwhile. And so whereas Beeching did tear up quite a few lines that shouldn't have been torn up, I do think that some of them had to go. I mean, if you look at the map, for example, of northeast Scotland, there were kind of railways everywhere out of Aberdeen in all sorts of little villages and halts and stuff. And, you know, they weren't really viable in the 1950s.
But some of them are being rebuilt, aren't they?
A few have been I mean, there was this kind of rebuilding Beeching, kind of reversing Beeching program, but it really involves maybe, you know, a couple of 100 miles of line, whereas Beeching actually closed 5,000 miles of line. So, and some of those had to go, and some of them shouldn't have gone. I mean, like Oxford to Cambridge, which they're now rebuilding, was completely daft. The Great Central, which went through the middle of England, would have been a great relief line, and actually would have been a great track for the HS2 to have been built on. That should never have gone. And so there's quite a few lines that shouldn't have gone, but some of them had to go. Really, realistic. I'm afraid the one at the end of your garden was probably not viable.
Oh, I'm not saying it was. But it's one of those iconic things, though. I mean, I think there would have been a lot of sadness at that time for all of these railway tracks to come up, because it's just something iconic about, particularly steam railways. I mean, I always remember one of the first films I ever watched in a cinema, The Railway Children.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's just a magical film. And I'm talking about the Jenny Agutter version.
It's funny that has survived right through to today. I mean, people do feel a love for railways that they really don't for any other form of transport, and there is a kind of romantic feel to it, and I think that has helped the railways politically, actually, to ensure that we do keep the lines that we have at the moment.
Chris says, please ask your guest if there are any plans for those involved in rebuilding the railways post D-Day to receive a specific campaign medal.
What a good idea.
That's a campaign for
That's a campaign for me. I must say, I think I'll try and mention this because unfortunately, they're all deceased, because I mean, they would be 100 years old at the minimum, and I couldn't find any. When I went to Normandy 2 years ago, I talked to all the veterans I could find, and I didn't find any railway veterans. But what a superb idea! A special campaign medal for the people who worked on railways.
Or some sort of memorial, monument, or statue, or whatever.
Absolutely. I have listed in the book. You can see in the book. I've listed the ones who were killed. There's about 100 and something that were killed, and there was ones we just come across that was collected for me by one of the Royal Engineers archivists, and certainly, you know, it would be a great idea to recognise these people, because they really haven't been, and I hope that the book does that.
We'll come to more of your calls in a moment. There's one here that's making me smile, so I'll make sure we'll do that, because see how we both answer this question. It's 8:45.
LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
Christian Wolmar is here talking about his book, The Liberation Line, the last untold story of the Normandy landings. But we're taking calls on lots of other things, including Labour's plans today to renationalise the railways, but any other transport issue. And Alexander in Liverpool has an interesting one. Go ahead, Alexander.
Iain, thank you very much. Yeah, we all remember, well, some of us remember, Dr. Beeching.
Yes.
Who destroyed an extraordinary network of railways throughout this country. It was like a cobweb, a wonderful cobweb of railways everywhere. You could go everywhere. And it was destroyed overnight. Why? Anyway, ever since then, we've needed another transport revolution. And it ain't happened yet. So, and now... But that was then. Now we have a climate problem, don't we?
So what are you suggesting?
Well, I don't have a car now. I've given it up because I'd come to live in Liverpool where public transportation is very good. And so I ask, have you and your guests or your phoners in, have you all got cars? Because if so, you need to question it. Why have you got cars? Is it because you can't get public transport? And if so, that's not your problem, that's the government's problem.
Well, I have a car, partly because I've always enjoyed driving.
I love driving.
But I live in a village, which and I need to get to the railway station to get to London.
You don't have a bus service.
No, well, I'm sure there is, but it doesn't go when I want it to go. And,
exactly.
Because I come into London at different times each day. So I have about a 10, 12-minute drive to the station. Mm. But interestingly, longer journeys now, I generally go by train, which I would never do. I mean, even 5 years ago, I would have always chosen to drive. I mean, for example, when I come to the Labour Party conference in Liverpool, I would always drive.
Oh, yes.
Whereas now, I take the train. And that I'm not sure that's been a sort of deliberate thing. It's just...
Is that environmental?
Well, it's partly because I keep getting caught speeding.
Yeah. No, I do own a car. But I must say, I do have the discussion with my wife. It just passed its MOT. And it did 800 miles or something in the year. And I just thought, why have we got it sitting there? And she said, oh, well, one of the grandchildren might need a trip to hospital or something. And I said, well, we could take an Uber, And so we slightly have
or hopefully a black cab.
So, even a black cab, yes. So we slightly have a disagreement over it, but essentially it sits there. Both me and my wife, default is the bicycle. I mean, I do about 3,000 to 4,000 miles a year on my bicycle. And that's just, I came into these studios by bicycle. That is my... But, I do think one has to recognise that I'm very privileged. I live in a city that has amazing public transport that I use when I don't use my bicycle. It has good bicycle lanes, thanks partly to Boris Johnson and people the mayors subsequently to that. And, some people just don't have that advantage. They live in difficult places where, they have to use their car.
Yeah, and there are many parts of the country where a car is a necessity. If you live on the North Norfolk coast, for example, okay, there are buses, but they're fairly infrequent. There is a train line that goes from Norwich round the North Norfolk coast, but I mean, I wouldn't say you could actually rely on that because it doesn't go to a lot of the places that people want to go. So, and I think that's true for a lot of coastal areas. So, I think a car is seen by many people who live in cities as a luxury, but for many of us, it just isn't.
But we ought to have policies that actually enable more people not to have cars. And that I think, ought to be the central tenet of Labour's transport policy. I mean, much more widely than just the railways. They ought to have a kind of notion that we will do everything to help people not have to use their cars. And indeed, I did notice that in their document, they've actually said that they're going to have modal share targets. In other words, they're going to have targets for trying to get people to use public transport more and cars less. So that will be interesting to see how that works out, because that's not going to be easy to bring about.
No, and it's all about habits, isn't it? Once you get into the habit of something, it's like I've got into the habit of going on long journeys by train now. Which if you'd said to me 10 years ago I'd be doing that, I'd have laughed in your face.
Really? Oh, really? Right.
And it's partly because, I had an electric car, but you can't use those for long journeys if you're not confident in the charging infrastructure. So anyway, that's what I do nowadays. Zach has got a funny one. What's your favourite tube line?
Well, I wrote a book called The Subterranean Railway, which is all about the tube. I've gone off a bit of the tube lately because of the noise. The noise is appalling now on the tube, and that's partly because of automatic braking systems, that they all brake at the same place, and so the rails get kind of used on those places. I find it very difficult. But if I had to name a line, I'd call the Metropolitan line, because it goes right out into the countryside, and some of the places you think are kind of little villages, and they're served by the tube.
I used the Elizabeth line for the first time a couple of months ago.
Not a tube line. Doesn't count as a tube line.
Does it not?
No, it's a proper railway that happens to have a tube name for it, but it's a mainline railway. It goes out 100 kilometres.
Well, I was really looking forward to it. I came back from a weekend in Dublin from Heathrow, and I was really looking forward to going on it again. And we got 2 stations up, and there'd been a fatality on the line or something, so it had to reverse. And oh my God, then getting on the Piccadilly line, it was like first class and cattle class.
Elizabeth line is, and I wrote a book about Crossrail.
Is there anything you haven't written?
No, there's very few things I haven't written about. But I wrote a book about Crossrail, which I should have called the Elizabeth line. The Elizabeth line is the greatest urban railway in the world. I challenge anybody on this programme to give a better urban railway than Elizabeth line. It is magnificent.
This is a text which says, "This has been a lovely hour, a nice break from the usual news stories." George is in Weybridge. Hello, George.
Hello there. Yes. Well, I was just phoning in because I thought what a bad idea it would be to nationalise the railways, because I remember when they were nationalised before and the chaos that used to exist, and the fact that the railways tended to get very old-fashioned, and no government could actually spend the money on modernising them, because you need a profit in order to make the money to modernise things. And in my youth, I worked for a group of chemical companies, and I found I could very quickly rationalise the companies and divisions in a short space of time. And when I left them, I joined the nationalised industry, which was a huge organisation. And I found that what used to take me perhaps a month in a private enterprise group of companies would take 2 years in the nationalised industry, because basically everything you did had to be you had to think, what would the government think about it? What's their view? And although you were judged by commercial criteria, you weren't allowed to operate in a commercial way. And people just, for example, my boss introduced me to the system, and he showed me a huge, great spreadsheet, and that contained everything that happened in the previous year, and you had to give the forecast for next year. And what he said to me was, you've got to be very careful not to be too ambitious, because otherwise they'll expect more from you next year. It was a totally different environment where you had, I remember one chap would come in every day, he would do the Daily Telegraph crossword and the Times crossword and go home. That's all he ever seemed to do. And it was just a stultifying experience.
Okay.
Where you felt as though you were trying to run.
Let's put that to Christian. Let's put that to Christian.
Yes, and I think it's a question of management. In the last 10 years of British Rail, they were led by a guy called Bob Reid. They created 3 sectors for passenger services, which were intercity, Network South East, and provincial, later regional railways. And this was a very effective structure, which was quite commercially driven, which actually reduced the amount of subsidy that was needed. They were well aware of the need to boost numbers on the railway. There was a guy called Chris Green who ran Network South East who actually increased massively the numbers using the railway, particularly off-peak. They were both commercially minded and socially minded. In other words, they did a good job of getting more people onto the railways, but also they ran good services where they were subsidised.
A crap service.
So
I remember British Rail. I used to commute into Liverpool Street from near Cambridge. And it was a terrible service, and I wasn't the only one to say this. People have this rose-tinted memory, and I think you do.
No, there were parts that were not as well run, and Liverpool Street services were famously underinvested in, but there were other services that were very well. Intercity was a brand invented by British Rail that was so successful that it's a name that's being kind of used across the world, that ran, relatively high-speed trains between the cities and actually made a profit, and it was a good service. So yes, of course it was like
now.
it was a curate's egg. There was some good service and bad, but just as they are now.
And I have to say, I'm lucky enough to live on a train line that is actually rather good.
Right.
But, anyway, we could carry this on for another hour, I think.
We absolutely could. And I'm glad your listener liked it.
Yeah, no, not just. There's been quite a lot of nice texts. So I just thought I'd read one out because people get annoyed when I read lots of those kind of things.
It's always good to chat to you, Iain.
And to you, Christian. And if you'd like to, if you've been intrigued by Christian's book, it's called The Liberation Line, The Last Untold Story of the Normandy Landings. Right, coming up in the next hour, the number of children in England drinking alcohol has soared in Generation Lockdown to reach record levels according to new research. 1 in 3 children have had an alcoholic drink by the age of 11 after a steep rise in drinking among the generation who grew up in the shadow of the pandemic. The study of children in 44 countries found that England was the country with the highest level of alcohol consumption among the youngest children, with rates much higher than France or Italy. Why? 0345 6060 973. Did your parents encourage you to drink alcohol as a child? I'll tell you if mine did. Clue, they didn't.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, the Scottish Green Party will join with rival MSPs to back